everyone. I'm Jennifer Rodgers, sitting in for Harry Littman on Talking Feds, and we're going to talk today about Supreme Court ethics. I know it sounds a little dry, but there's been some stuff in the news about it, and an interesting opinion I saw this morning that I wanted to share about this issue. So Amy Coney Barrett was the latest Supreme Court justice to come out and say in public remarks that she supports the creation of a binding ethics code on the Supreme Court justices. I mean, in some ways, this is a low risk statement, right? I mean, they have to impose it on themselves for reasons that I'll talk about in a minute. On the other hand, listen, I mean, Roberts has taken the very strong position that no one can force them to do anything. So the more of his colleagues that come out and say, listen, I think we should be subject to a code of ethics and some sort of enforcement provision for it, the more pressure it puts upon him and them to do something about it. So, here are the questions, right? How did we get here? What are the options for ethics at the Supreme Court? What are the chances it'll actually happen? And then, as I said, I want to talk about an interesting proposal that I was reading about and thinking about earlier today. So how did we get here? Well, of course, anyone who's listening to this and watching this will certainly be well aware of the scandals with Clarence Thomas and, to a slightly lesser extent, Sam Alito, about very lavish gifts that they have taken from people with an interest in the outcome of Supreme Court cases that they did not properly disclose. I mean, not just things like really fancy vacations and hotel stays and private planes and the like, but for Clarence Thomas, I mean, buying his mother a house. I mean, these are crazy things by people who are conservative donors and who sometimes have relationships to parties before the court, but even more than that, have ideological positions that they wish to push at the court. And none of these things were originally disclosed. So let me talk just for a minute about ethics rules in general. Ethics rules are designed to do a few things. One, to set expectations. If you set clear rules for people about what it is that they're supposed to do, and then train them, educate them on where those lines are, what those rules are, that's a benefit to everyone. They're designed to provide transparency so that when we know our government officials and people like Supreme Court justices who are making some of the most important decisions that you can make about what's going to happen in this country and how people's lives will be able to be lived, that they're doing that with only the influences we know about. In other words, if they're being influenced, at least we know how. And of course, they're designed to root out actual conflicts of interest and perceived conflicts of interest. All of that, of course, is designed to increase our confidence in government. And the Supreme Court has really suffered in recent years. I mean, public approval of them has gone through the basement, in part because of ethics scandals like the ones that are facing the current court. So, back to the facts of these scandals, I'm not going to rehash all the facts here, but one interesting thing is that even if people like Harlan Crow and Singer, who's the one who flew Alito around on his private jet, even if they don't have actual litigation in front of the court, even if they're not parties, which would be an obvious actual conflict of interest, they have clear ideological positions that they're pushing. I mean, they're making friends. They call, we're friends with the justices. We do these things for our friends. They're doing that for a reason. And it's because Harlan Crow, for example, doesn't want Justice Thomas to have to leave the court to live the lifestyle that he wants to live, that he clearly can't live on the salary of a Supreme Court justice. So Harlan Crow, supports that lifestyle to keep Thomas on the court. And he keeps Thomas on the court because Thomas does things that he likes. So that's why the disclosure aspect of ethics rules is so important, so that even if Crow isn't a litigant with an actual conflict that would have to be disclosed potentially, you can disclose the trips themselves. Like you have to disclose any trips that they're taken who paid by anyone, right? Not just parties to the court. And that helps us see who is influencing them, even if it's not influence on a particular matter that's before the court. So historically, there's been very little in the way of ethics rules on the judicial branch. Why is that? Well, just think about what it is that judges do as compared to people in the other parts of government. The judicial branch is vastly smaller than the executive branch or the legislative branch. And there's really no money being distributed out of the judicial branch. So there's virtually no risk, or at least very little risk, of corruption in the lower levels of the judiciary, except for the kind of almost like human resources types of corruption, like overtime, fraud, and things like that happen in any job. So, there's not as much risk of that sort of thing. Bribery, of course, is a concern with judges, but the way that the judiciary works tends to minimize the risk for that. For example, random assignment systems, the way that cases are randomly assigned, lifetime tenure for federal judges, quite long, usually tenure for state judges, and an incredible incumbent advantage that means that state judges also don't turn over very often. So you're risking something real, right? If you're taking a bribe as a judge, you're risking a lifetime judge or something, a lifetime job or something close to it. And judges get paid a decent amount. I mean, they're not millionaires usually, but they get a decent enough salary that it's usually not something that they would risk for a bribe. So for those reasons, bribery in the judicial branch hasn't traditionally been a huge problem. There are disclosure requirements for lower level judges, and what I would call a weak enforcement system for enforcing that code. There's a Council on Judicial Conduct that provides rules and disclosure requirements and some measure of enforcement, but that doesn't apply to the Supreme Court. Why is that? Because there's no one above the court to enforce it. For these lower courts, you can say that the Supreme Court can impose enforcement, but for the Supreme Court, there's no one to enforce it. So the Constitution says that as long as judges have good behavior, that they serve as long as they have good behavior. So they're not forced to put in an enforcement mechanism, because the only way to remove them per the Constitution is impeachment. That's it. So that's the argument, at least, that Justice Roberts and others have advanced, that it would be a separation of powers problem for Congress to dictate an enforcement scheme for an ethics code. And without an enforcement scheme, any ethics code is effectively voluntary, which is how they've always treated the ethics code as to them, as a voluntary ethics code, even though they say they do try to comply with it. As we've seen from recent news events, that attempt has not been good enough. That's where we are now. Some argue that Congress does actually have more power over the court than that, but who would decide that question, right? If Congress passed a law that says we hereby impose a mandatory ethics code on the Supreme Court, and we impose the following enforcement scheme, immediately it gets litigated, and the Supreme Court ultimately decides that question. So that seems like kind of a non-starter. Okay, so what are the options for enforceability given this sort of pickle that we're in? Well, anything that they put into place themselves would work. Of course, institutions aren't great at policing themselves, unfortunately. We've seen the strongest oversight in the executive branch, in part because that's where the money is. That's the biggest branch, the most complicated branch. That's where all the money is kind of doled out to run the government. But it's also because they're not the ones putting the oversight in place, right? It's the legislators in Congress who actually passed the Inspectors General Act and continues to tweak it to ensure that there is good oversight of the executive branch. And that actually gets to the proposal that I was reading about today that makes a lot of sense to me. So the Inspectors General system and the federal system is tied to agencies. There are more than 70 federal inspectors general. Most are tied to agencies. There are a few special ones, like for reconstruction in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example, or oversight of big programs like the COVID relief program. But they oversee either an agency or a program, and they are importantly independent. And so while they oversee an agency and in some ways are part of the agency, they're independent from it. They report to Congress as well as to the agency head. And so they have the independence they need to make sure that the ethics rules are followed in that agency. And that's really what you want, because if you don't have an independent inspector general, you end up with the kind of oversight that exists in the legislative branch, which is basically these committees, right? A Senate Committee of Ethics and a House Ethics Committee that effectively do nothing. In the judiciary, again, it also is self-oversight. They have the Council of Judicial Conduct and they police themselves. It's better than nothing, but it's not great. So, what I saw this morning that seems really interesting to me is a proposal by Professor Steve Vladeck of the University of Texas Law School. He has a Substack called One First that's really good. I highly recommend it to anyone who's interested in the Supreme Court. And his proposal is something that actually has been proposed in Congress before, at least along the lines of things that have been proposed before, and that's for an inspector general for the judiciary. And you should read Steve's article. As I said, it came out today. If you're interested in, he really parses through the constitutionality of how they should propose it to make it constitutional. You can't just, again, have Congress pass a law that says we hereby appoint an IG for the judiciary and give it this much money and, go forward. There would have to be fairly thought out provisions on how it is constitutional to do that. But the upshot is that he thinks it could pass muster even as to the Supreme Court justices if the law required that the IG just collect the disclosures, investigate lack of compliance, and then not enforce it themselves, but refer it for discipline to the judicial conference where appropriate and make their reports public so that Congress would actually be able to utilize them for impeachment if that were appropriate. If nothing else, an inspector general would actually give us someone who would look at these disclosures that are, according to them, supposedly now being filed voluntarily, would parse through them, would do some investigation, and would provide some public reporting about what happened here. It would allow us to have a governmental function doing that and not just rely on investigative journalists who've been the ones to look into this and break these stories to date. And it would give Congress a basis to seek impeachment if that were appropriate, or the judicial conference to try to do something on enforcement if that were appropriate. So that seems to me like an interesting possible solution that maybe, at least some way towards getting some public confidence back in the Supreme Court after this huge string of ethics scandals. We'll keep an eye on that too, of course, as always. I'm Jennifer Rodgers in for Harry. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.
Hey everyone, Harry here. Hope you're enjoying the content from all the friends of our channel, great experts in their fields all. I want to thank them for stepping up to the plate while I'm away. I'll be back soon, and I'm looking forward to resuming the daily videos. Talk to you later.